An external call is also important, and this is God working through other people to extend his call. Now, when we look at the ministry of the church, the things that make it church, proclaiming the gospel, administering the sacraments, those are tasks that God gives to his church, not to individuals, but to us as the body of Christ in a specific place. God gives those responsibilities to congregations, but he also gives them details about how to use them. And one of the things that God teaches is that certain people ought to be appointed to offices of ministry, to have the specific responsibility on behalf of that congregation to serve them with gospel and sacraments, or in whatever subdivision of that we find in a particular role. And so we see this. The church calls someone to that office not as a whim, not as an idea of what they might want to do that day, but as a way of carrying out the work that God's given them to do. We see that, for example, in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 14, we read about elders, that's the same word as pastors, being appointed in the churches. Or in Romans chapter 10 says, "How can people call on one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in someone in whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach if they are not sent?" Someone is sent to preach that word so that people can hear it and so they can believe it. They're set aside. They are ministers. Now think of it in a practical way. It might be easy to find someone in the church who's willing to do some of the parts of the office of ministry. I'll bet if I asked my congregation if anyone would be willing to do a baptism, if they thought it was okay, I'll bet a number of people would be willing, because that seems like a fun thing to do, and it really is. I'll bet that I could find someone willing to conduct a wedding or two. They probably would hesitate after one or two, because weddings can be awfully hard work, but I'll bet for at least for one time I could get someone to do that wedding. But I think it might be considerably harder to get someone to volunteer to conduct a funeral. It's harder to do some of these functions or to deal with the problems that come up in people's lives. I'm sure I could get someone to go to volunteer to visit the hospital to see a friend of theirs. But what if someone they didn't know went into the hospital at 3 a.m? Who would they call then? Who would they turn to? Having called ministers makes an easy answer for all these questions. For you have someone who's put in a position where it's their responsibility to do specific things, but also in a place where they've received training to do those things. I have to tell you, as a pastor, when I first thought about being a pastor, the idea frightened me. The idea of preaching seemed like a scary prospect to me. It was only after I received training and experience doing it that I learned that I liked to preach, and that I was pretty good at it. Training helped.